Best Workplace Revenge Stories, ProRevenge compilation served cold. The email goes out at 9:17 on a Thursday morning. Daniel is sitting at his kitchen table, laptop open, coffee untouched, watching the sent confirmation appear on his screen. 3 months of work. 93 days of documentation, drafting, cross-referencing, and quiet patience, compressed into a single send. He does not celebrate. He simply watches. For approximately 4 minutes, nothing happens. The company he used to work for is just starting its morning. People are filing in, setting down bags, refilling mugs, pulling up dashboards. Normal Thursday. The director who destroyed his career is probably in her glass-walled office already, arranging her agenda, taking credit for work she did not do, the same way she did every morning for nearly 2 years. Then the phones start. Not his phone. Theirs. Daniel knows this not because he can hear it, but because he has spent 3 months understanding exactly how the sequence will unfold. He knows which clients open emails first. He knows who among them will pick up the phone immediately and who will forward the message to their legal team before making a single call. He knows the rough order in which the confusion will arrive, and then the questions, and then, for some of them, the anger. What the company receives that morning is not a threat. It is not a complaint. It is simply information. Accurate, sourced, carefully structured information about a pattern of conduct that their clients had a reasonable interest in knowing. Nothing in the email is false. Nothing in the email is even particularly surprising, if you had been paying attention. But they had not been paying attention. They had been too busy assuming that Daniel was gone, dealt with a problem that had been neatly resolved with a fabricated performance review and a forced demotion he had declined to accept. They were wrong about that. Within 20 minutes of the email going out, the company's main line begins receiving calls. Not the usual Thursday morning inquiries. These are different calls, measured, careful, the kind of calls that start with phrases like, "We've just received some correspondence and we'd like to understand the context," and, in one case, simply, "We need to talk." By mid-morning, 3 of the company's largest accounts have requested urgent meetings. By early afternoon, 2 more have put their contracts under review. The director is no longer arranging her agenda. She is in an unscheduled meeting with senior leadership, trying to explain a paper trail she built herself, and which Daniel had simply organized, consolidated, and passed along to the people who deserved to see it. Daniel finishes his coffee. It has gone cold. He does not mind. But to understand why Daniel spent 93 days building this, why a man who had every reason to walk away and never look back instead chose to sit with his anger until it became something precise and useful, we need to go back. Back to a Tuesday morning, 14 months before that email was ever written, when his director walked into a leadership meeting with a presentation Daniel had spent 6 weeks preparing, and introduced it to the room as her own. He was sitting in that room. 3rd seat on the left. She did not look at him once. That was not an accident. That was a choice. And it was not the first time. Daniel had joined the company as an operations manager 2.5 years earlier, brought in specifically to rebuild a logistics function that had been running on inherited processes and goodwill for far too long. He was good at his job in the particular way that makes people uneasy, not showy, not political, just relentlessly effective. He asked the right questions. He built the right systems. He produced results that were easy to measure and therefore easy to take. His director, a woman named Renata, had understood this from the beginning. Not consciously, perhaps, or perhaps entirely consciously, it is difficult to say, but she had understood that Daniel's output was valuable and that his temperament made him unlikely to fight for credit. He was the kind of person who believed that good work spoke for itself. Renata was the kind of person who understood that good work only speaks for itself if you control the microphone. For the first year, the arrangement was almost comfortable. Daniel built things. Renata presented them. The company did better. Everyone moved on. Daniel told himself this was how organizations worked. He was pragmatic. He was patient. He was, he later admitted, naive in the specific way that competent people sometimes are, believing that the system would eventually correct for the imbalance. It did not correct. It accelerated. By the second year, Renata had grown confident enough to begin the next phase. She started excluding Daniel from meetings his work had generated. She began reassigning his direct reports without consultation. She introduced a restructure that moved his key responsibilities into her direct remit, leaving him with a title that remained the same but a role that had been quietly hollowed out. And then, when Daniel began, carefully and professionally, to push back, she did something that crossed a line he had not anticipated. She fabricated a performance review. Not crudely. Renata was not a crude person. The review was technically structured, full of the correct language, citing incidents that had been real but had been reframed so thoroughly that Daniel barely recognized them. A moment where he had flagged a risk became evidence of poor judgment under pressure. A period where his workload had been deliberately reduced by her own decisions became a record of declining output. The document was designed to justify a demotion and to make Daniel look like someone who had simply stopped performing. She submitted it to HR on a Wednesday. By Friday, Daniel had a copy. This is where most people would have made a mistake. They would have gone to HR immediately, or confronted Renata directly, or escalated in the kind of emotional, reactive way that gives the other party exactly the ammunition they need to say, "You see, this is what we were dealing with." Daniel did not do any of that. Instead, he went home that Friday evening, made dinner, and sat down at his kitchen table with a notebook and a very simple question: what do I actually have, and what do I still need? He had been keeping records for months, not out of suspicion, simply out of habit. Timestamps on emails. Calendar invites showing when he had been included and then, gradually, excluded. Draft documents with his name on earlier versions. Meeting notes. Delivery confirmations. The quiet, unglamorous archive of a person who did his job carefully and kept evidence of doing it. What he had, it turned out, was substantial. What he still needed was a little more time and a clear understanding of the audience. So he began. Not with urgency. Not with rage. With the same methodical patience that had made him good at his job in the first place, now redirected, entirely, toward a single purpose. 93 days later, the email went out at 9:17 on a Thursday morning. And Daniel sat at his kitchen table and watched the sequence unfold, exactly as he had planned it. This is that story. Daniel had been with the company for 6 years before Renata arrived. 6 years of building systems that worked, of solving problems before they became emergencies, of being the kind of operations manager that other departments quietly relied on and rarely thanked. He was not the loudest person in any room. He did not need to be. His work spoke for itself, or so he believed, until he met someone who understood that in the wrong environment, good work is simply raw material for someone else's reputation. Renata joined as Director of Operations 18 months into what should have been Daniel's most productive year. She had a polished presence and an instinct for institutional politics that Daniel, by his own later admission, did not see coming. In their first month working together, she asked him to walk her through every active project, every workflow, every vendor relationship he had spent years cultivating. He obliged. He was thorough. He wanted her to succeed, because her success, he assumed, was also his. The first sign that something was wrong came at a cross-departmental strategy meeting. Daniel had spent 3 weeks building a logistics optimization framework, a real piece of work, detailed and tested, the kind of thing that takes months to design properly and minutes to present badly. Renata presented it. Not as something Daniel had built. As something the operations division had developed. Her leadership? Her direction. Daniel sat in the room and watched the CFO congratulate her. He said nothing. He noted the date. That detail matters. Daniel noted the date. He had already been keeping a working document, not because he suspected what was coming, but because he was the kind of professional who documented decisions and correspondence as a matter of habit. That habit would become the most important thing he did in those 18 months. Without it, the story ends very differently. Over the following 6 months, the pattern repeated with a consistency that almost required planning on Renata's part. A supplier renegotiation Daniel had led for 4 months appeared in her quarterly report as a personal achievement. A staff scheduling overhaul he had piloted was cited in her performance metrics without his name anywhere in the documentation. His direct reports began receiving instructions through her rather than from him. One by one, his responsibilities were redistributed, always with a reason, always framed as a structural decision rather than a personal one. Always deniable. And then came the performance review. Daniel had received strong reviews for 5 consecutive years. He knew what his record looked like. What Renata submitted to HR was something he did not recognize. It cited missed deadlines that had not occurred. It described a pattern of poor communication that no one who worked with him would have supported. It rated him as underperforming against targets that, when Daniel went back to his records, had never been formally set. The review was fabricated, not entirely, not clumsily, but fabricated in the precise way that is designed to be difficult to disprove without evidence. Renata had made one assumption about Daniel that proved to be catastrophically wrong. She assumed he would be embarrassed enough to go quietly. Daniel did not go quietly. He also did not make a scene. He did not argue with HR, did not confront Renata directly, did not CC anyone on an emotional email at 11 at night. He went home. He opened his documentation folder. And he began building something. What he built, over the following weeks, was a rebuttal so thorough it had its own table of contents. Every claimed missed deadline was matched against a corresponding email in which the deadline had been moved, with Renata's signature on the change request. Every project she had claimed as her own initiative had a version history, a draft timestamp, or a chain of internal messages that traced the work back to Daniel before she had arrived. The performance targets she had cited as unmet were, in several cases, targets she herself had quietly revised downward in documents Daniel had been copied on and had kept. She had built the paper trail herself. Daniel had simply refused to throw any of it away. He did not send this rebuttal to Renata. He did not send it to HR. He compiled it, formatted it, and requested a formal meeting with the board's internal audit committee, a channel that existed precisely for situations where a management dispute required oversight beyond the line of reporting. It was an unusual request. They agreed to it. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Daniel arrived with printed copies for every person in the room and a clear, calm summary of what the documentation showed. He did not characterize Renata's behavior. He did not use words like theft or sabotage. He presented dates, documents, and discrepancies, and he let the committee draw their own conclusions. Renata was not in the room. She would not have an opportunity to prepare a response to evidence she did not know Daniel had. The committee's investigation took 5 weeks. During that time, Daniel continued to show up, continued to do his work, continued to be exactly as professional and unremarkable as he had always been. People who knew what was happening later said they found this almost unnerving. He showed no visible anxiety. He was simply waiting for a process he trusted to complete itself. What the investigation uncovered went beyond what Daniel had submitted. When the committee pulled the full documentation around Renata's performance reviews, not just Daniel's, they found a pattern. Other members of the team had received reviews that did not align with what peers or project records showed. In 2 cases, positive recommendations Daniel had written for his direct reports had been altered before submission. She had not just managed him badly. She had managed everyone around her as instruments for her own advancement, and she had done it consistently enough that the evidence was embedded across the company's own systems. Renata's departure was announced internally as a mutual decision to part ways. No one on Daniel's team was particularly surprised. No one said very much about it in the open, but Daniel noticed, the following week, that 3 separate colleagues stopped by his desk to tell him they were glad he was still there. His formal demotion was reversed. His title was restored. The performance review Renata had submitted was flagged, formally annotated, and removed from his record as if it had never existed. The board did not make a ceremony of any of this. There was no apology letter, no all-hands announcement. It was simply corrected. And for Daniel, correction was enough. He was not looking for a moment of public triumph. He was looking for accuracy. He wanted the record to reflect what had actually happened, because in the long run, that is the only thing that matters. Reputations are not built on arguments. They are built on records. Renata had understood that well enough to try to alter his. She had not understood it well enough to cover her own tracks. Daniel stayed. He rebuilt his team, quietly and methodically, the same way he built everything. His logistics framework, the one Renata had presented to the CFO 18 months earlier, was formally attributed to him in the company's annual operations review that year. His name, in the document. No asterisk. Some victories look exactly like what they were. Some people in positions of authority have a particular weakness. They need to be seen winning. Not just right, winning. Visibly, publicly, undeniably winning. And that need, more than anything else, is what makes them dangerous to work for. It is also, eventually, what makes them very easy to dismantle. Priya had worked in customer service long enough to understand one thing clearly: the job was not glamorous, but she was genuinely good at it. As team lead, she had spent 2 years building a floor that ran on trust. Her team hit their metrics. Their customer satisfaction scores were consistently in the top quartile for the region. Staff turnover, which had been a quiet crisis before she arrived, had dropped to almost nothing. Priya was not the kind of person who needed praise for this. She knew what she had built. That was enough. Her branch manager, a man named Gareth, had arrived 18 months into her tenure. He was the kind of manager who understood optics better than operations, always composed in front of senior leadership, always quick to attach his name to a win, and always looking for somewhere to redirect the weight of his own errors. The floor had learned to watch for the signs. When Gareth went quiet after a meeting, something was coming. And it was never pointed at himself. The specific incident that set everything in motion was, on the surface, unremarkable. A scheduling conflict had caused a staffing gap on a high-volume day, a bank holiday weekend where call volumes were projected to run at approximately double the standard rate. Priya had flagged the gap in writing 3 weeks earlier, sent a follow-up, and received a response from Gareth saying he would handle the additional resource allocation. She filed the email and moved on. Gareth did not handle the additional resource allocation. On the day itself, the floor was undermanned, call wait times ballooned, and 3 escalations reached the regional director's office before noon. That afternoon, Gareth walked onto the floor in front of the full team, 31 people at their stations, and in a voice that was controlled but absolutely audible across the room, told Priya that her planning had been inadequate, that this kind of failure reflected poorly on the entire team, and that he expected a written explanation of what had gone wrong on his desk by end of business. Priya looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Of course." And she went back to managing the floor. Here is what Priya did not do. She did not correct him in the moment. She did not raise her voice. She did not send an urgent email to his supervisor that afternoon, still hot with the humiliation of it. She understood something that takes most people years to learn: reacting fast feels good, but it changes the story. If she responded immediately, she became the emotional one. The difficult one. The one who couldn't take feedback. The incident would get reframed, and Gareth, who was practiced at reframing, would control the narrative before she had finished typing. So Priya waited. She wrote the explanation Gareth had requested. It was precise, professional, and it contained no accusation. It simply outlined the timeline of the staffing decision, her original flag, her follow-up, his written confirmation that he would handle it, attached as appendices. She submitted it by end of business, exactly as instructed. She kept a copy. Over the following 6 weeks, Priya did something methodical and quiet. She spoke individually with 7 colleagues who had been on the floor that day. Not to recruit them, not to build a coalition, just to ask, calmly, whether they remembered the afternoon. Whether they remembered what had been said. 3 of them offered to put something in writing, unprompted. She accepted. She stored those statements carefully, time-stamped, with the original email chain, and said nothing further to anyone. She also began keeping a log. Not of grievances or facts. Dates. Incidents. Decisions Gareth made that bypassed her input, performance feedback he gave her verbally but never formalized, resource requests she submitted that went unanswered. She kept the log the way a good accountant keeps records, without emotion, without editorial, without any assumption about what it would eventually be used for. And then she waited for the calendar to do its work. Gareth's annual performance review was scheduled, as it was every year, in the first week of November. The review process included a 360 feedback component, meaning that his direct reports were formally invited to provide input into his assessment. Most employees treat this as a formality. Priya did not. She submitted her feedback the morning the window opened. It was thorough. It was documented. It referenced specific incidents by date, cited the written evidence where relevant, and described, with professional precision and zero exaggeration, the pattern of what she had experienced over the past 18 months. She did not use words like unfair or humiliating. She used words like inconsistent, undocumented, and contrary to the written record. She named the staffing incident specifically. She attached the email chain. She noted that she had submitted a written explanation as requested, and that the explanation had documented the decision-making chain clearly. She also submitted, through the company's formal grievance process, a complaint about the public reprimand. Time to land the same week. Not because the timing was vindictive, but because the timing was relevant. A manager undergoing performance review while a formal grievance has been filed against him is in a very different position than one whose record looks clean. Gareth's review did not go well. The documentation Priya provided was not the only unflattering feedback in his file. It turned out she was not the first person to find his management style difficult, merely the first to arrive with paperwork. The formal grievance triggered an HR investigation, which surfaced the email chain, which made his public reprimand of Priya extremely difficult to justify. The investigation concluded that the staffing failure had not been Priya's responsibility. That finding was added to her personnel record. Gareth's was updated accordingly. His bonus for that year was withheld pending review. The raise he had denied Priya the previous spring, citing performance concerns he had never formally documented, was approved by his interim replacement before the quarter was out. Gareth remained at the company for another 4 months. He left quietly, in the way that people tend to leave when staying has become untenable without anyone technically asking them to go. Priya was still there. Still leading the floor. Still hitting her metrics. She never spoke publicly about any of it. She did not need to. The record spoke with perfect clarity, in the calm, professional language she had spent weeks preparing. The last word, it turned out, was not the one Gareth said on the floor that afternoon. The last word was a line in an HR investigation report. And it was Priya's. Priya understood something most people miss: timing is the difference between a complaint and a verdict. The next story is about a man who understood something slightly different, that the most powerful thing you can do in any professional dispute is make sure your opponent signed the document that defeats them. Marcus had been freelancing for 6 years by the time Vantage Creative approached him. 6 years of building things other people put their names on. 6 years of learning, quietly and precisely, exactly how this industry worked, and exactly where it tended to go wrong. So when Vantage sent over their standard contractor agreement, Marcus did something most freelancers never do. He read it. Every clause. Every subclause. Every definition tucked into the appendix that most people assume is boilerplate and skip entirely. And then he sent it back with edits. The project was substantial. Vantage had landed a regional hospitality group as a client, hotels, restaurants, a spa brand, and they needed a complete brand identity system built from the ground up. Logo suite, typography, color system, iconography, brand guidelines document, the works. Marcus quoted accordingly. The number was not small, but it was fair, and Vantage agreed to it without negotiation, which, in retrospect, should have told Marcus something about how seriously they intended to honor it. The contract he returned to them included 3 clauses that were not in their original draft. The first established clear deliverable milestones tied to payment tranches. The second defined satisfactory completion with specific, measurable criteria rather than leaving it to the agency's subjective judgment. The third, and this is the one that mattered, was a licensing reversion clause. In plain terms, if full payment was not received within 30 days of final delivery, all intellectual property rights to every delivered asset reverted entirely to Marcus. The agency could not legally use a single file. Vantage's creative director read it, made no comment, and signed. The work took 11 weeks. Marcus delivered it in phases, as agreed. Each phase was approved in writing via email, Vantage's creative director responding with variations of "great, love this," and "the client is going to be very happy." The final delivery included a 64-page brand guidelines document, a complete logo suite in every required format, a full typographic system, and a custom icon library of 42 icons. It was, by any reasonable measure, comprehensive and professional work. Vantage showed it to their client. The client was, indeed, very happy. The hospitality group signed off on the brand. Vantage began preparing for full rollout. And then the invoice came due. The email Marcus received in response was a masterclass in vague corporate language. The project, Vantage explained, had not met their internal quality benchmarks. There were concerns about the deliverables. They would need to discuss a revised fee structure before any payment could be processed. There was no specifics. No documented feedback. No reference to any of the written approvals they had given over 11 weeks. Just the sudden discovery, precisely when payment was due, that the work was somehow unsatisfactory. Marcus had seen this before. Not with Vantage specifically, but with the type of agency Vantage was. The kind that treats freelancers as vendors to be squeezed rather than professionals to be paid. The kind that assumes a solo contractor has neither the resources nor the nerve to push back. They had misread Marcus on both counts. He did not reply immediately. He waited 48 hours. Then he sent a single, measured email. He acknowledged their message. He noted that all deliverables had been approved in writing at each milestone, and he listed the dates and the precise wording of each approval. He referenced the contract's definition of a satisfactory completion, the specific, measurable criteria they had both agreed to, and noted that every criterion had been met and confirmed. He stated that, under the terms of the contract, payment was now overdue. And then, calmly, at the end of the email, he included one further note. He reminded them of the licensing reversion clause. He explained, precisely and without drama, that if full payment was not received within the 30-day window specified in the contract, all intellectual property rights to every delivered asset would revert to him automatically, as agreed. The logo they were currently using in client presentations. The brand guidelines their client had already signed off on. The icon library. The typography system. All of it. Every single file would become legally unusable by Vantage or their client the moment that clock ran out. The hospitality group's rollout, which Vantage had already begun coordinating, would have to stop. The reply came in 4 hours. It was considerably less composed than their previous correspondence. The creative director called. Marcus let it go to voicemail. The message was a confused mixture of reassurances and veiled suggestions that Marcus was being unreasonable. Marcus listened to it once, saved it, and replied by email only. He had, by this point, also consulted briefly with a contract solicitor to confirm his position was exactly as solid as he believed it to be. It was. The 30-day window was now at 22 days. Marcus continued to reply to Vantage's increasingly urgent emails with the same measured, factual tone. Yes, he understood their position. No, the contract did not contain a provision for renegotiation after delivery and approval. Yes, the reversion clause would apply automatically. No, there was no mechanism by which he could waive it unilaterally. The clause had been drafted to be non-discretionary specifically to prevent this kind of pressure. He had, it turned out, written that particular clause with exactly this scenario in mind. On day 28, Vantage paid. Not the revised figure they had briefly floated. Not a partial payment pending a resolution. The full invoice amount, plus the late fee Marcus had written into the contract, a modest percentage per week on any overdue balance, compounding from the original due date. He had included it in the same appendix most people skip. Vantage had signed it along with everything else. The total came to slightly more than they had originally hoped to avoid by claiming the work was unsatisfactory. Marcus sent a receipt, confirmed that the licensing rights remained fully with Vantage as per the contract terms now that payment had been received, and wished them well with the rollout. He has not worked with them since. He has also never removed that licensing reversion clause from any contract he has signed in the years that followed. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from knowing your paperwork is airtight. Vantage assumed that Marcus, like most solo contractors, would find a legal dispute too expensive and too exhausting to pursue. They were not wrong that disputes are expensive. They simply failed to account for the fact that Marcus had designed a remedy that required no dispute at all. The clock ran. The clause applied. There was nothing to argue about. The trap had been built into the document they had signed, on a day when they thought the document did not matter. It always matters. Marcus won because he read the fine print. The next person won because they wrote it, from the inside of a company that never saw them as a threat. Until the day they became one. Priya understood something most people miss: timing is the difference between a complaint and a verdict. The next person understood something equally precise, that the most dangerous document in any workplace is the one they ask you to sign on your way out the door. Claire had worked as a senior analyst at a mid-sized financial services firm for 6 years. 6 years of building reporting frameworks from the ground up, 6 years of being the person the compliance team called when they needed something done correctly and quietly, 6 years of institutional knowledge accumulated in careful layers, the kind of knowledge that takes years to build and about 3 weeks to destroy if you replace the person who holds it with someone who has never seen the inside of a regulated industry. She was good at her job. Not in a way that required a spotlight. In a way that required a functioning company, which she understood to be its own reward. Her team trusted her. The compliance officers trusted her. Even the auditors, who trusted almost no one, had her name in their contact lists. The restructure was announced on a Thursday. By Friday, Claire had been called into a meeting with HR and told her role was being eliminated as part of a strategic realignment. The word strategics was used 4 times. The word Claire was used once. She received a severance offer, a non-disparagement clause, and a request to spend the next 4 weeks completing a knowledge transfer with the new hire who would be absorbing her responsibilities. Claire signed the severance agreement. She declined to sign the non-disparagement clause. They didn't push it, they rarely do when they think the exit is already controlled. She spent those 4 weeks doing the knowledge transfer with genuine professionalism. She wrote detailed handover documents. She walked her successor through every process, every reporting cycle, every regulatory deadline. She was thorough. She was patient. She was, by every account, a model of gracious departure. She was also paying very close attention. What she saw during those 4 weeks filled in gaps she had suspected for months. The new hire was capable but junior, significantly junior, and being brought in at a salary that was, by Claire's estimate, about 30% below what Claire had been earning. The role description had been quietly rewritten to remove the senior classification. The compliance responsibilities that had sat with Claire's position for 3 years had been redistributed informally, off the books, onto team members who had not been trained to carry them and who had no idea they were now legally exposed. More than that, in walking her successor through the existing systems, Claire encountered documentation, or more precisely, the absence of it, that she had previously assumed was being handled by someone else. Reporting shortcuts. Undocumented manual overrides in systems that regulators expected to be fully automated. A gap in the audit trail for a process that the firm had certified as compliant in its last regulatory submission. Small things, individually. The kind of things that accumulate quietly until someone asks the right question at the wrong time. Claire made notes. Careful, specific, dated notes. On her last day, the HR manager handed her the standard exit interview form. Single page. Multiple choice. A few lines for comments. The kind of form designed to generate data that confirms everything is fine. Claire thanked her, took the form home, and began writing. What she submitted 2 days later was not a single page. It was 11 pages, single-spaced, organized by category, process integrity, compliance risk, documentation gaps, personnel exposure, and regulatory discrepancies. It named no individuals, she had no interest in targeting people, but it described every systemic failure she had observed with the precision of someone who had spent 6 years watching those systems run. It was honest. It was professional. It was, she later said, simply accurate. She submitted it to the firm. She also submitted a copy to the industry regulator. This was not a creative legal maneuver. This was not a loophole. In her sector, employees in senior compliance-adjacent roles have a legal obligation to report known regulatory discrepancies to the relevant authority. Claire had not invented this obligation. She had simply never had cause to invoke it before. Her exit interview had given her cause. The firm received the regulator's notification that a review had been initiated approximately 3 weeks after Claire's last day. By then, she had already taken on her first consulting client, a smaller firm that needed exactly the kind of regulatory framework expertise Claire had spent 6 years developing. She billed at a rate that made her former salary look modest. The compliance audit took 7 months. The findings were, by all accounts, consistent with what Claire had documented. The firm was required to remediate every identified gap, retain external compliance consultants to verify the remediation, and pay a regulatory penalty that landed at roughly 14 times the cost of Claire's severance package. The certification they had submitted, the one that described as compliant a process Claire had flagged as non-compliant, generated a separate inquiry. That one took longer. Claire was not involved in the audit. She had done her part on the way out the door. By the time the penalty was issued, she had 2 more consulting clients, a waiting list, and a professional reputation that had, if anything, grown. The HR manager who had handed her the single-page form was, by most accounts, confused for quite some time about what had happened. The executives who had structured the layoff as a cost reduction exercise had a clearer understanding. The numbers made it plain. What is worth noting, what always bears noting in a story like this, is what Claire did not do. She did not threaten. She did not leak anything to the press. She did not contact former colleagues to coordinate, commiserate, or campaign. She wrote an exit interview. She submitted it to the people it was legally required to reach. And then she went to work. The firm had built the situation themselves, the undocumented workarounds, the informal redistribution of compliance duties, the certification they should not have submitted. Claire had not created any of it. She had simply been the person who knew where it was, and when they handed her an exit interview form and asked her to be thorough, she was exactly that. There is a particular kind of institutional arrogance that assumes the person being shown the door is too relieved, too exhausted, or too eager to collect their severance to look closely at what they are walking away from. It is an expensive assumption to make about someone who built your compliance framework from scratch and kept meticulous notes for 6 years. Claire was consulting by the time the audit began. She was expanding her practice by the time it concluded. The firm's restructure saved them Claire's salary for approximately 3 weeks before the regulator's letter arrived. After that, it cost them considerably more than they had planned to spend. The exit interview form is still, presumably, single-page. Multiple choice. A few lines for comments. Some forms never learn. For stories. For different industries, for different wrongs, for different methods of correction. And yet every single one of them moves to the same rhythm, patient, precise, and unhurried. That is not a coincidence. That is a principle. Think about what Daniel, Priya, Marcus, and Claire actually did. None of them made a scene. None of them sent an angry email they would later regret, or confronted someone in a corridor, or vented loudly to the wrong colleague at the wrong moment. They did not give the people who wronged them anything useful. No outburst to dismiss. No emotional reaction to reframe. No dramatic exit to use against them later. They kept their composure, and in doing so, they kept their options open. That is the first thing they all understood, that reacting too early is the same as losing early. The moment you show your hand, the other person starts planning their defense. The moment you escalate without evidence, you become the problem. The wronged gets to play victim, the situation gets muddied, and the clean story you had becomes complicated. Every one of these four protagonists resisted that. They sat with their frustration, which is genuinely difficult, and they converted it into something more durable. Documentation. Timing. Contractual precision. Procedural honesty. Things that do not deteriorate under pressure. The second thing they understood is that the wrongdoers were always going to do most of the work themselves. This is worth sitting with, because it changes how you read every story in this video. Daniel's director did not just take credit for his work once, she fabricated a paper trail to justify a demotion, and that paper trail is exactly what the board used to understand who had actually been doing the work. She built the case against herself, line by line, because she was confident no one was paying close enough attention. She was wrong about that. One person was paying very close attention indeed. Priya's manager publicly humiliated her for his own mistake, in front of witnesses, on a full floor, in a moment he clearly thought demonstrated authority. What it actually demonstrated was his willingness to deflect accountability in front of a crowd. Priya did not need to prove he was that kind of manager. He had already proven it himself. She simply made sure the right people were in a position to consider the evidence at the most consequential possible moment. Marcus's agency voided a payment clause by calling his work unsatisfactory, work they had already presented to their most important client, which rather undermined the claim. The agency's own eagerness to use the deliverables before resolving the dispute made the licensing reversion clause land exactly as hard as it did. They were so certain the contract was boilerplate that they never checked what it actually said. Marcus had checked. Repeatedly. And Claire simply told the truth. Thoroughly, precisely, and in the format the regulator required. The company had accumulated years of compliance shortcuts under the assumption that departing employees would say nothing, sign everything, and move on quietly. Claire was not quiet. She was, however, entirely composed. There was nothing retaliatory in what she did. There was nothing that could be framed as vindictive. She answered the questions she was asked with the accuracy they deserved, and the consequences that followed were the consequences of the company's own choices, arriving on a schedule they had not anticipated. The pattern here is not revenge in the way the word is usually understood, hot-blooded, impulsive, proportionate only to how angry someone felt in a specific moment. What Daniel, Priya, Marcus, and Claire practiced was something colder and considerably more effective. They identified what was actually true, gathered or preserved the evidence of it, and then waited for the moment when that truth would do the most work. They did not manufacture the moment. They recognized it. That distinction matters. None of these outcomes were engineered from nothing. Every one of them was built from materials the wrongdoers themselves provided. The fabricated review. The public humiliation. The voided contract. The undocumented workarounds. The protagonists in these stories did not create the problems their antagonists faced. They simply declined to absorb them quietly, and then waited, with considerable patience, for the right structure to place those problems back where they belonged. There is something almost structural about the way entitlement operates in every one of these stories. The director who took credit for Daniel's work was not being cautious, she was being careless, because she had been careless before and it had worked. The branch manager who blamed Priya for his mistake had almost certainly done the same thing to someone else, who had either accepted it or left. The agency that tried to void Marcus's invoice had probably done it before, with designers who did not have that particular clause, or who could not afford to wait out a dispute. The company that laid off Claire and then pretended it was structural had restructured around her without anyone flagging the risk, because no one had expected to be accountable. Entitlement does not appear from nowhere. It is usually built on a series of moments where the consequences never arrived. Until they did. What all four of these protagonists understood, intuitively or deliberately, is that the consequences were always going to arrive eventually. Their job was not to force them, it was simply not to prevent them. Not to sign the form without reading it. Not to accept the demotion without noting the discrepancies. Not to walk out of the exit interview without answering honestly. Not to let the public humiliation pass without a record. They refused to be the buffer between the wrongdoer and the results of the wrongdoing. And that refusal, exercised calmly and without drama, was enough. There is a kind of discipline in that which does not get discussed enough. It is not the discipline of doing something difficult. It is the discipline of not doing something easy, of not reacting, not confronting, not venting, not giving the other person the narrative control that comes with making you look unstable. It is the discipline of staying precisely in the position of the person who was wronged, rather than doing anything that would complicate that story. It requires patience, and a certain confidence that the truth, properly documented and correctly timed, will eventually do what a confrontation in a corridor never could. Daniel walked away clean. Priya got the raise. Marcus got paid in full, with interest. Claire was consulting before the audit even began. Not one of them needed to raise their voice. Not one of them needed to make a scene. The scenes made themselves. The protagonists simply made sure they had a good seat when it happened. If you found these stories satisfying, and the fact that you are still here suggests that you did, then next time, we are looking at what happens when the stakes get higher and the timelines get longer. We have a story involving a decade-long paper trail, a non-disclosure agreement with a clause nobody noticed, and a company that really should have checked who they were dealing with before they started. Stay subscribed. These things take time to do properly. But then, the best ones always do.